Good afternoon, everyone. I know that people are still signing into the session, so we'll give just a few minutes for people to get logged in, and we'll start the live session shortly. All right, I think we can probably get started. Again, good day, everyone. Welcome to this virtual roundtable session. My name is Scott Crawford. I head up information security research here with the 451 Research Group as part of S&P Global Market Intelligence. I'm joined today with several colleagues and practitioners in the field of security for operational technology, and we're going to discuss the field of managed detection and response for OT. Managed detection and response, as a lot of security professionals are already well aware, has become very visible in the IT security marketplace for many reasons, not least of which that many organizations continue to have ongoing issues with finding, retaining, cultivating, and promoting expertise in cybersecurity to meet what is a constantly burgeoning and expanding set of needs. But there's an area of security that requires some specialized expertise, and it includes expertise and familiarity with operational technologies across the industries in which they may appear. There's a lot of issues in terms of embracing security for operational technology that practitioners need to keep in mind. For people with a background in IT security or cybersecurity practice, there are specific issues regarding operational technology they need to keep in mind, and vice versa. For those who are professionals in operational technology, there are aspects of security with which they may or may not be familiar. There's implications for securing those environments that they would be well served with expertise in cybersecurity and operational technology both, for making the best use of the investment in securing this critical aspect of both technology and the physical realm in industries across the board today. So with that, let me introduce our panelists to you. Let me start with Steve Osipek from DeepSeas. Steve, please feel free to say a few words about you and about DeepSeas as well.
Absolutely. Hi, I am I'm the threat unit research unit leader at DeepSeas, and I'm a distinguished engineer from IBM. I have a history in network security, and have been through a network access control was an early set of patents for me. I've been a network nerd ever since, and then got into the security industry early on. Built a number of penetration testing and incident response teams. So done a little bit of everything. Great to talk to you today.
Likewise. And Danielle Jablonski with Nozomi Networks.
Yeah, hi, y'all. Thanks for having me here, and I'm really honored to be with this esteemed group of colleagues today. At Nozomi Networks, I serve as an OT cybersecurity strategist, which means I dabble a little bit in awareness and technical nuance, a little bit in market analysis, and a lot in industry and government relations. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, where I do independent research on risk prioritization for industrial control systems and OT networks. And my background before that was in nuclear weapons cybersecurity policy. So really happy to be here and happy to learn from everyone as well.
Great to have you here, and equally esteemed, Danielle. That's quite a resume as well. Pia Capra with Booz Allen.
Great, thank you. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and excited to have this conversation with all of you today. My name is Pia Capra, and I am currently the leader of our OT cybersecurity practice here at Booz Allen Hamilton. So we work with a lot of clients as they're embarking on their journey to secure their OT environment. So helping them understand where vulnerabilities are, and then helping to address those vulnerabilities. And, I started in traditional network security, IT, and then about 6 years ago, transitioned over to the OT cybersecurity side of the house. So have a lot of experience with kind of bridging that gap between IT and OT realms, and really excited to talk about that today.
Great, thank you for joining us. Bill Jones with Train Technologies.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Bill Jones, Director of Cybersecurity Architecture and Engineering for Train Technologies, Scott led with. Great to be here. Thanks. It's a great panel. I'm interested to hear what they have to say. My background is a mixture of military and technical. So Army reservist to do cyber policy at the Pentagon as an Army reservist. In the same sense, as the director of architecture and engineering for Train, we're doing all the cybersecurity posture for both our OT and IT systems. And so really trying to implement those security controls, know what assets we have, and figure out the best ways to protect them. So.
Great. Thank you for making the time. And Johan Ferme, fellow analyst here at S&P Global Market Intelligence. Johan, welcome.
Thank you, Scott. Great to be here in this panel. I'm a senior research analyst at S&P Global. My focus area is in the digital transformation, where we look at technology, how it's implied and deployed in verticals. My primary focus is the energy sector, but I have 10 plus years of experience being a practitioner in the security field, implementing ISO 27000 projects, as well as being a CISO before joining 451. And I'm the analyst lead on OT security at 451 Research, part of S&P Global.
Great. So we do have a very comprehensive, very accomplished panel here to discuss this topic. And so I'm looking forward to hearing this combined wisdom and experience being shared with our audience today. Johan, let me start with you, since you've been researching this area as an industry analyst pretty consistently for the last few years. Why don't we start with a couple of things? Let's just start with how OT security is different from IT security, first of all, and some of the incidents that you've seen.
Well, I think that, and that's the basic premise of this panel session, I think, is that we need to realize that OT security is different from IT security in many ways. I think, first of all, it's about the impact. If you go to work and your email doesn't work for a couple of hours, who cares? You start working on something else. But if your main production line is down, so the impact is much bigger. The second thing is much more differentiated than the office IT equipment. You have laptops, tablets, smartphones, and that's about it. Maybe some printers and servers. But in the operational world, there's thousands of different devices, from small actuators to thermometers, maybe less compute capacity, but driving $1 million processes. The third thing I think is the legacy, where we're used to getting new laptops every 3 years or so from the office. Some equipment in especially critical infrastructure is in use for decades, and some things even predates the internet and is now being connected. So the operational managers, people, engineers in the OT environment do not understand the threats that come from connectivity, while our IT security analysts often do not know the threat scenarios that can happen in an OT environment.
Indeed. What are some examples of incidents that you've seen that have kind of characterized the nature of events that have shaped OT security over the last couple of years?
Well, I think it's very interesting to see that still most of the threats and the incidents that we see originate in the IT network of a company. If I'm looking back specifically at the beginning of the Russian war in Ukraine, it was the Biden administration calling out for attention of more attacks on critical infrastructure. Haven't really seen large incidents since 2022. But looking at some of the major incidents over the past years, I'm seeing 2022 Oil India Limited, 2021 Colonial Pipeline, and the Florida Water Treatment Plant. In 2020, Tower Semiconductors, and in India, in the beginning of the COVID area, Dr. Reddy Laboratories had to shut down production facilities all over the globe. 2019, Norsk Hydro and the Kudankulam nuclear power plant in India. So you see a lot of critical infrastructure being attacked. Healthcare is notorious as well, but primarily it's all about ransomware, getting in through outdated software, or careless account sharing for remote access, or clicking infected emails. And that corresponds with our research. We recently conducted an OT security survey, which shows that despite the warnings of in the geopolitical tensions, North American enterprises are not really worried about nation state initiated attacks. It's only 29.7%. Europe is a little more worried, 45%, but the majority is still most concerned about criminal activities. So criminal hacking groups intent on getting ransomware installed and getting Bitcoin ransoms.
Danielle Nozomi, before I go on, I should note for our audience, there is a Q&A facility. So if you have questions for our panel, navigate to the bottom of your screen there. You should see a widget for Q&A. Pop that up and feel free to pop your questions into Q&A. We'll take those during the conversation as they come up. Danielle, Nozomi Networks works directly in the space with technology to both detect and respond to events as they occur. First of all, does that kind of agree with your sense of the landscape? And secondly, what's different about threat detection or malicious activity detection in operational environments?
Sure. I do agree with everything that was stated so far. There's a couple other examples of incidents versus, the ones that got attention versus just kind of security events that are mitigated in real time that could have been worst case scenarios. And so that all depends on the controls you have in place. So for us at Nozomi, we really do our due diligence to make sure we understand the difference between a security event mitigated in real time and a cascading incident with second and third order consequences. So, the favorite kind of response from every cybersecurity person is it depends. But what I like to remind folks is that cybersecurity is categorical, not mathematical. So solutions are mathematical, coding is mathematical, technology can be mathematical, but cybersecurity is categorical. So when we look at categories, we need context. Some false assumptions out there that I've seen recently are just focusing on capabilities, which I call a means-based approach, versus effects-based approach, right? The impacts to your business, the impacts to your technology, the impacts to your processes. So that's one difference where OT is really obvious. The impacts are actually very obvious, and working back from an effects-based rather than a means-based approach with your risk management priorities and your resources can actually set you apart. And then we really root down to the detection level. For folks that aren't really familiar with, the back end of how those solutions work, I frame them as two types of detections. There's something that happened or a situation that is ripe for exploitation. So I like to talk about this like as if somebody has a keyless car, you have your key fob, and if you leave your key fob in your car and walk away, an alarm sets off that says, hey, this key is in the car and you're not here. This situation is ripe for a bad incident, right? Somebody potentially stealing your car, you locking yourself out if that's possible, et cetera. And then there's a different type of alert on your vehicle for theft, right? When your car is locked, the key's not in it, and something's happening with a sensor on the outside of your vehicle saying, hey, somebody's breaking in actively, right? So those are the two types of alerts when it comes to detection that we combine in these solutions. And then the other distinction for OT is process values. So of course, we can look at all of the communications data, what's operating on your network, how your nodes communicate, when they communicate, but we can also look at the process and the outputs of what you're operating and say, do these specific sensor readings and outputs align with what they're supposed to be doing and producing, or is there some type of change in a frequency for this process that's worth investigating? And when we use continuous monitoring and pair all of those things together, you get this early warning capability to reduce the severity of those potential incidents earlier, to reduce dwell time in these networks, and to avoid those worst case scenarios that we kind of rattle off in OT security. And it's a good thing we haven't seen more of them, to be quite honest. I love to underscore that.
That's true. It better be prepared than not. It's an interesting aspect on both the proactive and reactive side of both detection and response there. Let's come back to that here in just a little bit. But before we do, Pia, you've been involved a lot with the organizational aspect of implementing approaches to securing operational technology, particularly organizational transformation. But detection is only part of the story. There's the response processes involved that engage people in IT and operational technology and security across the board. How does that approach to response, and particularly the organizational transformation aspect of that, how does that differ from typical IT security processes? And what have you seen in your career in that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's definitely an interesting topic when you look at it. I think Danielle brings up a great point about how technology can enable that visibility into both the process and the security side. And it's really important, as we see, Johan mentioned, there's been that big increase in ransomware, right, that we see that is impacting the OT environments. And because these actors are looking for those softer targets because they know they'll get a more immediate response from a victim if they are getting into those operational environments that will affect the bottom line. And so when we look at doing these transformational opportunities and especially enabling cybersecurity within operational technology environments, it's really, the triad of people, process, and technology, right? You've got this great, rich technology that can give you this data, but then what do you do with it? How do you utilize it to respond to events and to also educate the individuals at the shop floors to make sure that they have an understanding of the potential risks that exist within their environment? And so it's finding a common language between the two organizations to be able to bring them both to the table and have clear communications. And that's super important when we get to that response aspect of, a detection like Danielle was talking about, because in IT, the first response may be, hey, I'm going to contain this laptop. I'm going to take it offline. I'm going to do some forensics, figure out what's going on, maybe re-image it, and then, put it back out into the environment. But in OT, you don't really have that option. You have to understand where that technology exists on a line, where it is in a process, what that process is doing, and then understand how the malware is impacting that specific device. And the best option may be, hey, we're going to wait. We're going to let this process finish, go to completion. And then during our next outage, we're going to be able to take that offline. But in order to make those types of decisions, you have to have both players from the OT organization as well as the IT organization at the table and speaking the same language. And so it's a lot, the tools that are utilized today, like from Nozomi, are able to help provide that foundation to bring these two organizations to the table to be able to have a common conversation about what's going on within the environment.
Bill, does that line up with what you've seen as well, as far as organizations that you've worked with? And kind of going beyond that question, what kind of guidance would you offer, having been in a position of leadership on the security side, for organizations involved in OT security? What do leaders need to be aware in terms of embracing this as part of a comprehensive approach to security? Oh, you're on mute, Bill. Sorry about that.
Got to be prepared to unmute yourself. I think it's two big components. One, so I worked for the Postal Service, where we had a big, giant operational technology environment where we had to move the mail, and we worked in the security there, and then Trend Technologies as well. So we've got a large operational technology environment, and we're producing HVAC systems. So I think it's a couple of things. I think it's risk posture. I think the plants that Pia kind of alluded to it, it's that they're most operationally risk oriented. The plants just got to keep moving. And then they view technology as a black box. And it's like this thing, information comes in, information comes out, but they don't really know. So when the black box keeps moving, they don't really care. Just keep moving the piece that's getting produced or sent or whatever's going through that factory. And so it gets to that organizational alignment is, okay, guys, the technology actually has to be maintained too, just like your factory floor has to be maintained. And that organizational alignment has to happen at all layers, like Pia alluded to. I think it's the alignment at the senior leadership, which is generally easier to get, but all the way down to the plant floor, where they actually understand the implications of, hey, we're going to take your systems offline for an hour a day. We're going to implement these controls, and this is the impact of these controls. And most of the time they view it, you're making my job harder, frankly. And so getting them to truly understand why we're making their job, in quote unquote, harder, and the risk we're reducing by putting those controls in place, like Daniel Software, other software solutions to protect the environment. I think that's foundational. And then if you get into what's different about it, I mean, that operational sensitivity I kind of alluded to, the complexity, we talked a little bit about that. I mean, the protocols are totally different than the IT environment. The scope of the devices, the edge compute, Johan talked about that. It's very, very complex environment. The age of the devices, from brand new all the way back to not on the internet, like Johan said, and then that whole concept of patching, something simple as basic IT, it doesn't work the same. You've got to know everything on your environment, but there's a lot of the same too, Scott, I would say. I mean, there's a lot of things you can't protect what you don't know. If we don't know what's in our environment, and I know some of the software solutions will provide that, you got to know what they talk to, what those assets are, who they're communicating with, how they're working, how they're improving the operations of the function of the environment. And then you got to maintain those assets. Those things don't change, whether it's an OT security strategy or an IT security strategy.
Yeah. Just Steve, kind of piggybacking on Bill's comment there, talking about what you know and don't know. Asset discovery is one aspect of this, but this kind of speaks to the issues with the expertise and the tools required to be effective at this. We've heard a lot, as I mentioned at the top of the discussion, the industry has heard a lot about managed detection and response. We see it quite a bit in the industry. But MDR for OT, that may not be as familiar to people. So as far as what's different about OT security, specifically about managed detection and response, what have you seen at Deep Seas and actually throughout your career?
Sure, absolutely. The detection is actually thanks to OT security devices like Nozomi. The detection lines up pretty well in some ways, right? And I'll caveat this in a minute with what we do on the IT side. And I just mean from the flow. I mean from events coming in to a central place, analysts dispositioning threats. You'll see threats that are similar to some of the IT world, like a C2. Like if a system is beaconing out, it's using a command and control channel, it's been compromised, it beacons out to maybe a known malicious IP. That's the kind of alert that a good example of a very IT-like alert you might get. The difference, as has been said, I think this has been said several times, it's a really good point, is the R, right? The remediation side is very different. As was said, I think, Pia, you brought this up, you can't really contain or block. You can't, like you said, in IT, you would take a laptop off of the network. You would get something out of the way. This might be unlike a lot of IT resources. You have the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability. It's all been pounded in our heads from CISSP days, right? Sean Harris, availability is going to win the day here, right? That's a lot of times that can depend on safety. A lot of times availability matches right up with safety. So the R is where things get interesting. There's also things leading up, though, that to set up for success, like I said, I'm going to caveat the detection side. Some basics, yes, some basics from the perspective of the behavior, but to really get good at detection, we do need that security assessment and some upfront, because we have to be ready during the response phase to actually change, maybe do segmentation, what we used to call compensating controls. Like if you read the NIST 800-82 is really good for this world because it talks about things in that same context that we learned about the IT security side. But in the OT world, they talk a lot more about putting things in the way, putting a bump in the wire to protect a device that can't protect itself. Real common one we get with technology like Nozomi is it tells us rightly, this is Windows 7. It's running this very, very important system within, let's say, a hospital like oil and gas or a blood gas machine or an MRI, right? Those are the real killers inside of that space as far as availability. And you have to protect those at all costs. Things like patient monitors, not as interesting to the doctors and clinical engineers, but there are certain critical systems. And what we're going to do is use those technologies within these appliances and these capabilities that the solution providers give us and tune that configure that so that it's very powerful in maintaining what is supposed to happen in that environment. There are environments where even the introduction of one new device is reason to respond and get that kicked off. So that it's the same workflow, but it's a lot more about upfront, and it's a lot more about the remediation and high fidelity alert strategy, what you do when something goes wrong.
You know, there's an aspect of not just remediation, but also discovery as well, too. And you touched on it, Steve, a little bit, talking about availability. One of the questions we get regularly from audience as well as from the people that we hear from on this subject is there are some systems operational technology that simply cannot be taken offline. You know, there's some subtlety around that, obviously, depending on the industry and the nature of what's at stake here. But we do hear about that a lot. How do you deal, and I'll throw this open to anyone who wants to respond, how do you deal with that, or how have you seen organizations and industries deal with that when they tell you, we simply can't take that offline, we can't remediate that, it can't go out of control? Or just as significantly, this is a safety of life issue. If you take this offline, upstream processes are going to fail. I remember one time talking to someone in the oil and gas industry about process management, and I got laughed in my face because he said, UIT people have no clue when it comes to process. We're talking not only about safety of life, but safety of entire communities here. So anyone who wants to jump in on that, how have you dealt with that when it's come up? Because sometimes it has to be done.
Yeah, I can go ahead and jump in this one first. I think it's something, like you said, when we go into these OT environments, we hear that a lot, right? I think the most common phrase is every site is different. So we can't do the same thing at every site. And we've got legacy operating systems that can't be taken offline because they are our most critical processes. And I think, Steve, you hit a little bit on this, talking about the NIST 882, but being able to align those compensating controls to be able to, put a boundary on these devices and the environment in itself, right? Because you're not going to be able to, whether it's because the site's different, the sites are all different, priority of your key sites, funding of what you're able to get for these larger OT security programs, you may not be able to put every single control out into your environment to protect these devices. But understanding where those most critical devices are, and if these devices that can't be taken offline are those critical devices, then what are those security capabilities, those compensating controls that you can put into place to protect those devices, but then also make sure you're getting visibility into those devices. So you can see, who they're talking to, what they're talking to, and when you're devising your alert strategy, especially when you're sending it to someone like a Deep Seas from an OT MDR perspective, making sure that those alerts are rising to the top of the list, because if they can't go offline, they're your most critical assets, then you want to make sure that if anything's going on there, you get an alert immediately and can respond to that and initiate that response procedure.
Hey, Danielle, let me ask you a question about the other side of that, which is discovery. That's not interfering or intervening in remediation processes or in remediation itself, but in terms of just doing asset discovery. There are situations where simply exploring an environment to discover assets, if you're interacting with it on a network, can have unforeseen consequences. It can be anything from interfering with a sequence of control actions that a specific OEM tech is expected to follow, and any sort of interruption for that can cause problems, all the way up to effectively denial of service in some of those cases. And since Nozomi is involved in the detection and the technology aspect of that, is that anything you've run into as far as detection and discovery of assets? And if so, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's something that we've historically been well graded on, and it's for a good reason. Our solution is purpose-built in OT. People tend to not understand what that really means. Down to that discovery level, we have built over the last 10 years, we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary, what we term asset intelligence. And when people kind of look through the data sheets, they think, oh, that must be another feature. But asset intelligence is actually our robust database from years of OEM partnerships and security research and tinkering in our labs and running these exact types of discoveries to basically understand what we're looking for, why we're looking for it, and how to find it. And if we can't find it in a passive sense, we have active inquiry, which are the feature is called smart polling for our solution. Other solutions have this as well, where they say, great, this is what I found from a passive capability with OT-based protocols, like Bill was saying. We can find these easily, and we can really narrow down the specs of the configurations on those, the software versions that they're running, things like that, that most companies have no visibility on, or that visibility is very outdated and very static. So knowing how to do that correctly is great. And then being able to assign those outliers that weren't able to have that kind of deep packet inspection work right off the bat from a passive scan. We look at active scans, and in our tool, at least, the active scan is opt-in. Search for this, query that, this is the language, this is how you do it, this is the protocol, this is the device manufacturer. And we're lucky to have, wonderful partnerships across the board with OEMs to have developed that. It's our secret sauce, right? That's the IP of these companies. It's not the signature-based threat intelligence that others have the exact same signatures for, right? It's the context of your environment, plus knowing what we're looking for and how to look for it, and really honing in on that. And a lot of security controls here have been mentioned. There are some things to do that, require building a defensible architecture.
Oh, Danielle, there you go.
I'm sorry. We've talked about some of those things. Pia mentioned everything but the word crown jewel. And she was talking about crown jewel analysis, right? That's a must before you deploy detection. Detection's not a savior. For a long time, people were saying, because perimeter security is dead, prevention is over, and detection now trumps prevention. Detection is prevention. At the end of the day, our tools are trying to enable the earlier discovery of security events and incidents across the industrial attack surface to provide real-time investigation, so you can not fall into the same trap as perimeter security did, where those defense in-depth strategies didn't take hold, or building those compensating controls, it didn't work the right way because you didn't analyze it from the right kind of inside out. So it's a great tool to have, but there are those other fundamentals that have been mentioned that are totally prerequisites: crown jewel analysis, segmentation and defense in depth, and hardening of your assets, including those intermediary assets between IT and OT. Those are must-haves if you want to deploy a continuous monitoring solution that's actually going to give you the bang for your buck.
Bill, you look like you might have had an opinion on
Nope. No, I was just agreeing. The defensible architecture, I'd say, is foundational, right? You've got to know what you're going to protect, as Danielle said, but having that architecture in place that knows, which VLAN, what assets are sitting in, what that VLAN can talk to, what assets talk to that VLAN, and that gets into the layered defense, right? I mean, so if you've gotten down to that level of analysis, then you know what's talking to what and what's normal. And now I'm geeking out on the technology a little more than I should be on a call like this, but that's really where you need to be. I mean, otherwise you can't protect. And these environments, I would say, to add on what Danielle said, these environments are old. So the perimeter may be dead for the zero trust world of the IT side. I tend to agree. I don't know at this point in these environments that the perimeter is dead yet. Maybe someday, maybe we get to that point where we have full-fledged zero trust at each of these endpoints and each of these manufacturing devices, whatever they are, but not right now. we can't afford to, frankly.
Got some issues with zero trust just in IT alone.
Not even going there. But yeah.
Yeah, we probably don't have time for that. Go ahead, Johan.
But speaking to the architecture, you're absolutely right, Bill. But there's a big difference between the theory and the practice. I've seen companies manufacturing for defense industries bound to very strict regulations. But if you get to the shop floor, they have this huge machine and that needs a 3D design uploaded. So what do? Okay, I'm gonna go to the patching room and I'm going to patch my office PC right into that operational network because it saves me a lot of time. So yeah, we have that architecture, but it's not 100% waterproof.
No,
Yeah.
it's not the end all be all.
Well, and to just circle back to Scott's question, which was, what do you do when this conversation becomes an intricate and delicate conversation for containment and patching? You look at the architecture. So yeah, maybe you can't isolate a specific asset, but can you do isolation based on segmentation? Yes. Can you do credential segmentation? Yes. If you have a new vulnerability with a high CISOs score and you know that that network somehow has internet access, then I'm going to push harder than you are. But if you come and tell me, no, we put all these sensors on a VLAN and we have these gateway capabilities and we have this access control, right? We don't use the same passwords. Then I'm going to say, okay, well, my severity of the understanding of that context based on your environment, which is all about your architecture, has me, a little bit less worried about whether you can patch or contain things versus, not having those fundamentals in line. And then it becomes a real kind of live fire exercise where anyone should be pushing for the same things, not just a solution provider.
But
You
it's
just
also,
said it. Oh, go ahead, Bill. Sorry.
no, I just add on Danielle said. I mean, I think there's also the component of having the right tools in place. If you've given the factory floor the right tools and know their use cases, to your point on that, okay, I do all my work on this PC that's on my IT environment, and I have to transfer that CAD drawing over to this machine in the OT environment. You've got to know that as you're doing the segmentation, as you're working through this, so you can give them the tools, whether it's a remote access tool, a pass through some tool server. I'm making things up here a little bit, but all those solutions are viable because that's exactly what Danielle just said. Architecturally, it's a crossover point that goes from one environment to the other, and maybe even have the ability to shut off all those USB ports and all those network connections in this plant, so they can't do the easy route. So,
And I think another piece to
sorry,
this.
go ahead, Pia. I keep
Sorry.
interrupting. My apologies.
No, no worries. I think another piece to think about too is a lot of times when you get that feedback from somebody at the site that, look, we can't take this device offline because it is so important, and understanding those things, not to discredit anything that they're saying, because obviously they know their business, they know their process better than any of us going in there and telling them what to do. But bringing that understanding of why we need to do these things and relating it back to them. I think Steve brought up safety when he started his first part of the conversation, where, you know, we think about confidentiality, integrity, availability. A lot of these sites are thinking about safety, and being able to relate cyber and cyber incidents and cybersecurity back to safety, back to business processes, and bringing that understanding and that translation is huge when it comes to being able to enable all of these compensating controls that we're talking about here, from, you know, providing that visibility into the network, providing segmentation, all of those types of things. And I think, you know, a lot of these OT devices, these OT tools that can provide that visibility into the security side of things, but also the process side of things, really can help bring the organization along to have those better conversations to say, okay, I understand, like, this is the asset you're talking about, right? You can utilize platforms like Nozomi to say, this is the asset that you're talking about. We can give you this data back to enable your processes and make better, efficient process decisions, business decisions, things like that. And being able to have that conversation so that you can go in there and put in those compensating controls that we're all talking about here. And I didn't want to lose sight of the fact that, like, we're talking about a lot of different security aspects that we can put into place, and having that security mindset, but taking that off and looking at it from a plant perspective and saying, okay, what matters to them, and relating it back to them so that you can do these things.
You answered one of the questions we had on the list here about dealing with OT professionals. And one of the issues I hear about sometimes is that people, particularly if they've been versed in IT security, they have a background that's amenable to IT and working with IT professionals, maybe not so much with OT professionals. And as far as the human aspect of that goes, some of the things that really stood out in working with OT pros, because as we've already discussed, availability, OEM specific knowledge are a couple of areas where they're very sensitive to, but you talk to some of the organizational aspects, I think we hadn't really touched on there.
Yeah, I think it's a huge piece. And, you know, I know there's a question about, you know, for IT security leaders who are trying to extend IT security programs to the OT side of the house, you know, a big piece of that is getting the advocacy from the OT side of the house when you're starting that journey. You know, finding somebody that can help advocate and push the messaging across from a leadership perspective is super important. I think one of one of the individuals that I work with, he says, when we go into these organizations, you know, good news travels fast, but bad news travels faster. So you have to make sure that when you're doing these things, that you're working in close conjunction with the OT organizations and have that buy-in and support so that you can help enable these programs. And I would say that's a kind of the first place to get started, is identifying who those key stakeholders, who those advocates are going to be on the OT side, and then figuring out, you know, what that target state is going to look like, that you can start working towards.
You had mentioned people, process, and technology earlier. You're focusing in on the people, I think, here, right? That's the main thing. Exactly. And who do we educate and deputize and influence. And I really like what you're saying. It's like walking around. I've seen tech leaders do this, especially in OT. It's, walking the floor, meeting the people, working with them, watching, see the thing that Johan described earlier, watching them take that workstation from one place to another and say, hey, what's this about? Can we make this better? If physical security does this really well, we need to do this in OT as, we need to take a page out of their playbook. They're focused on trying to get people within the environment to defend it or notice when somebody that's not supposed to be there. All that stuff with tailgating and, those kinds of things. The physical security side is really good at empowering and enabling. I think OT, you have to be like that. The folks that utilize this equipment, they have an investment in it themselves. They understand the equipment. A CNC engineer is not going to let you touch the CNC, right? They're not going to let you touch the machine. So it's figuring out how to enable them. I love what you said there. I just wanted to add on to it.
Steve, let me just follow up on that as far as extending the question that we got from the audience about that. So for IT security leaders looking to extend an IT security program into the OT world, what advice would you offer on how to get started? This is something that Deep Seas deals with pretty regularly.
Right. I mean, absolutely. I think it's along the same lines and dovetails from what we're talking about in involving the people, the processes and the technology. We've seen it. It always starts with somebody. Usually it's not in the people side. The need to the impetus to actually involve and start to do an OT security program. We all should remember too, there aren't that many OT security professionals just in terms of statistics and numbers and how much time we've spent training IT, right? So we have to start building those skills within the environment. And the tech, a lot of times it starts with the technology. I think it's fair to say a lot of folks buy OT security platforms, a lot of organizations, they might, install Nozomi. And as Danielle was talking about, get a lot of information, maybe way more information than they intended to get. A lot of times it comes in the form of the vulnerabilities that are discovered on the devices that, like in Nozomi fingerprints, using that active query technology. It gets a good sense of what's there, and then you get the list of everything wrong with it, right? And so that initial flood of data, sometimes it does one of two things. One is it might be, oh man, this is too much. I didn't mean to look at this. I don't know what to do with these. But of course, the right way to go about it is start to build the process around this. Okay, this is the vulnerability data. This is the data that's focused on the events. We're going to work with, of course, I'm very biased. You're going to work with an MDR to be able to build that out. But a leader that is doing everything themselves, the process is really to identify, it's been said on this call really well, the crown jewel analysis, find out which systems cannot be taken down that have a safety implication, and then focus on that. I guess what I'm saying is don't allow yourself, if you're early in this space, to get lost in the weeds of all the data you're going to get. You're going to get a ton of data. Focus on that crown jewel analysis so that you set yourself realistic goals as you work down the program. Is that fair? Yeah.
Can I underscore a couple of things just to
Please.
connect Pia and Steve? So you mentioned people, processes, technology, and Pia said, use your understanding to translate and inform people. But beyond that, something she didn't say, but she did describe again, was listening. Listening is so fundamental that we hadn't underscored, and then exercising. Doing these exercises before an incident is paramount. And I also love concrete recommendations. So 2 concrete recommendations I have for bridging this divide and never using the word convergence again is for the IT security folks that want to understand interoperability. There's a ton of awareness you can do that doesn't require any data. Awareness in terms of, hey, you know what we can't do for our business? We can't actually correlate number of emails sent to productivity. You know what we can do for our business? We can correlate bottles filled per hour to process optimization and production value, right? So that is eye-opening in and of itself. Has nothing to do with assets, has nothing to do with networks, has nothing to do with security, but it starts to create the right tone. And then I said 2 concrete examples. When your IT security folks ask you, wait, I can use Wireshark to analyze Modbus? It's the same tools. It's the same tools. So we do, there's a reason to talk about it in a completely different language and a completely different aspect in terms of the impacts and the operational resilience and the need to keep things online. But there are ways to bridge that gap when, yes, the security tools are the same. There are things you can use that you know how to use to analyze these in a different way with that understanding. And then to, I think, Pia's point on safety, The ISA safety standards are a behemoth. They're incredible. And having a process at your organization to walk your cyber folks through the scenarios that you can create from a cyber incident that would have the safety impacts that people already know how to discuss is just absolutely invaluable. And so all of that stuff is free as well. And again, not technical, not about data, not about forensic analysis, but really gets the conversation started so that your pizza parties aren't convergence is coming, right? It's oh my gosh, look at this crazy ISA presentation with 42 slides on safety. How can we think about this in terms of cyber scenarios? And also, what can't happen from a cybersecurity scenario? We don't talk about that enough. There are some times where people who don't understand operational technology will say, well, what if this happens? I always use this example of a city. People think you can turn the lights green in all the directions at the same time. And then operational folks can describe logic for the actual loop within the technology to say, oh, that's actually not that realistic. However, this happening from your parking meter to gain all the access to this in your city on your Wi-Fi is much more likely. So those conversations are just so important to have.
Yeah,
I
probably
think
kind of
there's a couple of different angles to this as well. I fully agree with what you said, Danielle, but I think as we're in the digital transformation, every company is more or less becoming a software-driven company. For instance, even if you look at construction company, they were used to building flats and factories and whatever, but now they're also installing the HVAC systems and building control systems, and suddenly the building constructor offers the building as a service, including 10-year management of the building control systems, etc. They've never thought about, okay, I've put bricks in there, but now I have to worry for the next 10 years about the personal information of the residents in that hospital. So basic IT security, sanitation, like awareness, start thinking about what can possibly go wrong. And if you look out there, another basic thing, just password management. If you Google, if you know the right sites, it will take you a few minutes to find thousands of ICS and SCADA systems still running, connected to the internet, running default passwords.
Bill, you don't have to. You don't. You don't have to do that. You don't have to swear.
I just
Cover your eyes.
Yep. We need some medical technology here.
No. Service accounts. Those are the other ones that scare me.
Service accounts. Yeah.
But Bill, you'd be the perfect person to remind folks that there are other compensating controls that aren't security controls. I think Johan brought up Oldsmar, regardless of the fanfare around that was, at the end of the day, it was incorrect reporting. There were other controls built into the process that had nothing to do with cybersecurity that would have prevented the worst case scenario. So again, we can't kind of run off the rails with our understanding or how we conceptualize the scenarios.
Which goes back to the original, it depends. That's good that one of us brought up. I can't remember even who said, because it really does depend. It was Danielle. Okay. I wasn't sure it was you, Danielle. Somebody said it. Because it does. It comes down to what you're defending and how it's defended and the layers of defense that come into it. To get to the question a little bit, extending that IT security program to the OT, there's a point where you can use the common knowledge of what IT security is, because the goals are the same. And so I think that's where I'd start, in addition to what everybody else has said about the buy-in from the senior leaders and all those things. But truly the goals are the same. You're still trying to protect that environment. Where it gets different is the nuances of those environments that we've already talked about. And so that's where the conversation in my mind starts as you start talking to senior leaders is, yep, we're still trying to do the same thing. Our goals are the same. How we handle it, how we protect it, the layers of defense, the authentication, et cetera, is going to be very, very different. And the fact that it is different enough, that's why there's justification for more resources when you start trying to extend it, because it's so different in many ways. And it's so the same in others. It's just that twisted application. It's like looking at a Rubik's Cube and looking at one side's IT and the next side's OT and the next side is your power system going into the factory floor. They're all related. They're all still trying to be protected, but you've got to look at them each from a different angle to get there.
Bill, something we talked about yesterday, and that's measurement and metrics and making those be of real service to security decision makers, and particularly the information that they take to financial and business decision makers as far as budget and investment. Danielle made a couple of great, gave us a couple of great examples of things that can actually be operationally measured that would be meaningful in terms of things like availability and productivity. Any guidance on that from your past experience as far as what you take to the people who sign the checks for what you want to do as part of a comprehensive policy strategy?
It's a hard one.
No
It is.
pressure.
No pressure at all. I was like, yeah, let me think of a
Your
good
Your
metric.
stakeholders are all
Yeah.
listening. Yep, your shareholders are on the call.
It's like, whoo, throw the softball at me, Scott.
Yeah.
No, I mean, for the folks on the floor, the folks in the manufacturing environments, it comes down to uptime. That's the metric that counts to them. And so then from our viewpoint, it comes down to how much downtime we impose on them. Because if we've got to minimize that downtime, whatever tool that we put in place, whether the Zoomi or something else, it's what we got to minimize the downtime, enable the tool, and get them back up and running. And doing that in a communicated, organized, coherent fashion with a strategy is essential. We can't be as haphazard as we may be in our IT environment, and that's not a metrics answer, I know, but it definitely is the fact. Because in IT environment, we can say, hey, go patch all these systems, and it's patch Tuesday, and our standard patch cycle is this, and people's machines just reboot. Cool.
Steve, as a service provider, you have some incidents you call on to probably give some validation to what's actually been seen in terms of incidents that would help with that, I assume. Does that sound like it? I mean, what I'm leading up to is just wrapping as far as, the MDR provider in this space, the things that they can bring to the table that the practitioner
Absolutely.
within an organization
Can I add to Steve's question just for the sake of the audience? Can
Sure.
you also talk about the role of vendors in OT and how different that is from an OEM perspective in remediation and response, whereas in IT, you typically don't call Microsoft for everything, but for OT, you might involve the vendors quite a bit more.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the precursors, right? In the detection and response capability, in the detection side, you're looking to catch the precursor. You're looking to catch the initial C2, like I said, or you're looking to catch something that leads up to it. There are environments where, like I say, if you get an event that even somebody's doing something as benign on the internet as a port scan within a sensor network, you're going to respond right away, right? But if you have high fidelity alerts. On the OEM side, the power of having a third party and working through an organization that does a lot of this is that those relationships, you're taking advantage as a client of the relationships that the providers built up. So there are situations where there is something very vulnerable within a system that's maybe got a small distribution set. It might be unique to the client that you're working with. They made a handful of these 10 years ago. There aren't that many of them anymore. This happens a lot. Even, and it is technically out of its end of life, but the organization is holding on to these devices because they're the ones that were custom made for their specific use case, and it gives them a business advantage, right? Manufacturing that kind of thing happens a lot. So that's where, depending on who owns the IP, being able to utilize, and on the broad strokes, the CVE, right? Everybody needs to get to roll their sleeves up a bit in the security research community that's working with OT devices and start really putting in those CVEs, and you see a lot of them, obviously. And of course, that feeds into the database, the Nozomi database, Danielle, you were talking about. But being on the edge of that, sometimes it's a matter of configuration. If there are controls within a specific device that are insecure, configuration, consulting around that can help to just disable the vulnerable systems. But from the behaviors perspective, a lot of times you're going to be doing that compensating control and go around it. And that's, again, where the response comes in. Not being able to wait. If you have, for example, this should not happen, but it happens. We were talking a bit about vulnerabilities that are just accessible from the internet. Census and Shodan, if you're familiar with those technologies. At one point, I think Shodan, they call it the search engine for the internet of everything. Great tool, right? It just trolls the internet, finds banners, finds things that are problematic, that are exposed. And a lot of times threat actors will look for those specific banners, right? And go after them. Having visibility, it all ties back into what you said, Danielle, about visibility. Having that visibility allows us to get in front of that to prevent all of that stuff that comes after. To your point, Scott, it's the early indicators from the MDR side that's really going to help us out here.
Just anecdotally, recently I was with a bunch of utilities in a specific sector for an event, and bunch of them said that they had left vendors out of their IR. It was the one thing that they had forgotten to include in their IR planning and processes was vendor conversations. And then I also teach at a local community college. And on our final exam, I had a lot of IT and network folks that were coming to this intro to ICS security course, and they forgot in 2 tabletops and in their final vendor remote access as a key risk, right? Because it's just not a component they think of as being paramount in those processes on the OT side. So a lot of learning.
And to your point, a lot of times those functions go outside of the core use case. It might not be our remote control from the vendor itself, but sometimes they have a third party. We found that as well. So it's a complete blind spot. No, absolutely. That's a really good point.
Don't forget the cellular connections that they put in the environment you don't know about. Just to be clear.
We got time. Yeah, go ahead, John.
To make a quick remark on something very important Bill said, it's if we're looking to implement our security strategy and from IT to OT, and we think a lot about the same things, but the tools may be different, and I think that's a key element. If you're used to network security, identity access management in an IT operation, maybe you require your employees to use double factor authentication for email by scanning fingerprints, but don't ask oil engineers on an oil rig or truck haulers with hands full of grease to use fingerprint authentication. So you need different tools.
Indeed. Pia, last thoughts from you? I'm sorry, I got you. Bad moment.
You got me right. No, I think, the metrics conversation that we were having is an interesting one too. We talked a lot about very similar tools or very similar things that we're trying to achieve when you look at an IT security program into OT, but it's different tools, it's different data. And I go back to providing that data in a usable format to the individuals on the shop floor. I think we've seen a lot of success with organizations who almost gamify cybersecurity to the plant managers. So, they're looking at safety metrics every day. They're looking at their process metrics every day, utilizing cybersecurity metrics in a very similar way that they're used to seeing that type of data, and then gamifying it into, this is, your site has the most legacy operating systems that are accessing the internet. Simple things like that can drive better cybersecurity behavior, I think is important to, what are some of those metrics that can help drive better cybersecurity practice, drive better outcomes. So that's just one thing, we were talking about metrics and we were keying on that. So I wanted to, final thoughts there.
And with that, I'm afraid we're going to reach the end of our time here. This has been a very engaging discussion. I have really enjoyed this. Thank you all to our panelists for joining us today. For those of you online with us, thank you for joining. We will make this available as well as a recording after the fact. And I'm sure many of you are joining for that recording. With that said, let me conclude with a thank you to our panelists. A thank you as well to Deep Seas for working with us on this event. Please feel free to reach out and contact Deep Seas at the URL you see below. And on behalf of those of us here at S&P Global Market Intelligence, my colleague Johan Vermey and myself, Scott Crawford, I thank you very much for joining us today, and we look forward to having you join us for our next event from S&P Global Market Intelligence. Thanks.
Michelle.